Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I am your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm the other co-host. Long may this survive, Ben Rose.
Good to see you, sir.
And you too.
Today, we've done our monthly sort of wrap-up of the news, but one of the things we didn't touch on was M&A, the big sort of mergers in this sort of last month. But I thought it'd be fun for us to dive into one of the things that makes this industry exciting and great, which is massive, massive mergers and acquisitions.
And if you didn't put the one and two together, M&A together, M&A stands for mergers and acquisitions. That's right, folks. I'm pretty sure you all already knew that, but just wanted to clarify.
Indeed.
And speaking of acquisitions,
you've got a brand new shirt.
I have.
Which, if you don't follow us on either YouTube or on LinkedIn, you don't get to witness the beauty of Ben's wardrobe choices at times. So here we are with, I assume this is your post-acquisition shirt where you're just beach vibing it.
This is my exit shirt. This is right after you've sold a company.
Yeah.
This is the kind of shirt you would wear, I imagine, as you retreat into exotic pastures.
You should have suntan lotion on your nose.
I should. Yeah. But anyway, mergers and acquisitions, very exciting topic in our space, and also a far-reaching one because it's always happening.
Yeah.
Sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes in insurer and reinsurer landscapes. Sometimes in broker landscapes. Sometimes they do rogue things like acquire other players like tech companies, which, by the way, we have some. No, we don't. I'm kidding. Always independent. But the whole space is obviously headline grabbing every time somebody buys someone else.
Yeah.
Where should we start?
I think we should start at the beginning. No, but what I mean by at the beginning,
that was profound. That's like at the beginning.
But the reason I said that is so much of the industry is rooted in M&A. Mm-hmm. When you look at many of the biggest firms now, they've accumulated, like very few firms have built a global footprint organically. They've grown to be a decent-sized broker in this state, and they've bought another broker in a neighboring state, or they wanted to go to a new country, so they bought one of the medium-sized brokers to give them a foothold there. Like in reinsurance, I think more than any other insurance-related sector, you don't see it in the insurers as much because of licensings and things, but within reinsurance, the reinsurance brokers and the reinsurers themselves, this concept of growth via this channel of acquisition or via this merger opportunity is sort of fundamental to most of the big brands that we have in this industry. So, you look back, and this goes back decades and decades and decades, but Pat Ryan and sort of Aon in that growth acquired like 170 or something, like some sort of absurd number. Again, fact check me on this later. But huge number of companies as they grew that business out. And he's doing something similar now with Ryan Specialty, sort of repeating that model. We oftentimes think about this from the Megamergers, Aon and Benfield, or Willis Towers Watson and Gallagher, or Aon Attempt. And then you have the Gallagher, Willis Re, you have GC and JLT. Those are the headline grabbers normally. But the number of times that Aon or GC like swooped up the biggest broker in Turkey or whatever it might be, right? That is always happening.
And I think on the underwriting side as well, right? You've seen, and I think in both the broking and the underwriting space, a lot of this acquisition thesis has revolved around access to business mostly. So it's been a way of avoiding barriers to entry or overcoming them. You acquire an existing entity that's already got the regulatory setup in a space. They've already got the access to customers and to partners. And you just want to pump money and resource into that existing play. Lloyd's, a massively common option there. We used to have a rule that only Lloyd's brokers could broker to Lloyd's syndicates. So huge American broking firms bought small local Lloyd's brokers in order to get access to the capacity that's sat at Lloyd's without having to pay a local wholesale broker to sort of do it for them.
Yeah.
And then similarly as well, the underwriters we've seen over time really keen, some of these massive firms, to set up a Lloyd's syndicate or to buy an existing Lloyd's syndicate, and then align their capacity from a group, whether that's like a Munich Re or a Berkshire Hathaway, some of these titanic firms, or even most recently, AXA, for example, where they staged a very controversial at the time acquisition of buying Lloyd's largest syndicate, XL Catlin, which itself had just been the the result of XL buying into Lloyd's when XL acquired Catlin. So I think most commonly you see, as you said in our industry, that acquisitions are a tool for growth.
Yep. Well, and you pointed out the access piece as well. When you think about it as a regulated industry, it's incredibly expensive to set up a new operation in a new country and get the local licenses and all those things. And actually buying even a small player is a far more cost-effective way of doing that than going to the local authorities, applying for your licenses, doing all the paperwork, setting up an entity, capitalizing that entity. All of that is so tedious. You're even seeing times, a lot of startups in the US are doing this. When you look at sort of the full stack startups, akin a Lemonade, a Metromile, or similar, they're actually acquiring like defunct shell company insurers that have gone out of business, but they still have a license to write homeowners in Arizona. And so that company doesn't exist besides on paper. They have no clients, they have no premium, but it allows a startup insurer to go, we can buy them for pennies on the dollar and at least have a license now to do business. We'll just flip it. We'll write that business on behalf of that company in that geography. And the same thing happens in new regions, or if you want to get access to Lloyd's, it's like, I don't need the biggest Lloyd's syndicate sometimes. I just want to be able to write from there. So who is someone who I can just sort of buy, because out of the box, I get a license, a Lloyd's approval, I get all of these things that are going to take me months and huge amounts of legal fees and everything else to get. So it's I think that's one of the drivers that you see.
Absolutely. And I think the common pattern here does tend to be a resource acquisition. So if you look at some of the old school theory, for those of you who like your strategy theory, you look at the main resources or the main factors that make up a company's capabilities. You have their value proposition, what they offer to customers that's distinctive. You have their profit model, how they make money. You have the resources, which is all the employees and the customers and the assets that they actually use. And then you have the processes that they use by which to convert all that stuff into their profit model and their value proposition. And pretty much exclusively in our industry, we see resource-based acquisitions. They're not changing the value proposition very much at all. They're not changing the profit model. Again, it's like they're still going to charge that same rate that they charge always. They're still, for brokers, it's a consistent commission. For underwriters, there's still going to be another underwriter on the slip at the end of the day. And they're not changing the processes. They're carrying on doing things the way they were before. It tends to be what I think is called a sort of leverage my existing business model or leverage my business model approach to an acquisition, where you add their resources, trim any fat that you didn't need as part of that, and hope that it will lead to either a more premium market position or alternatively, as we discussed, a sort of growth gain or efficiency. I think our industry historically hasn't really given a damn about efficiency, which is one of the really interesting things here, because most other industries, it's been a cost play. Economies of scale, massive fixed costs enable us to say, we used to have to be two separate companies that had a factory each with identical machinery. Now we can close down their factories, take all their customers and their top patents and things, and build everything in one big factory. Or we can, deliver to twice as many customers, but use our existing fleet of lorries that were half capacity. Yeah. That's not happening in our industry, right? You get some points where it's like, we don't have to have as many claims people or something because the claims team are under capacity anyway. But it's like, no, we every extra deal comes with an extra broker or underwriter or an extra team of support staff. So most of the sort of efficiency gains claimed as part of an acquisition are not really what they're going for most of the time.
Well, it's pretty prominent as well, because in the Aon attempt to buy Willis, Greg Case made a lot of noise about here's all the efficiency gains we'll deliver to clients and I think everyone kind of went, well, we're not entirely convinced by this.
Well, this was the really interesting thing, because that was part of it, but actually I think the headline of a lot of the publicity that went out about that merger was around innovation.
Yeah.
And there was this narrative painted as part of it, which was along the lines of clients are changing at a faster rate than ever before. True, absolutely the case. The industry is struggling to keep up with their needs. Yeah, absolutely with you. The only way that we're going to be able to innovate enough to keep up with their needs is if we stick the two of the biggest players in the industry together. And I think that's where they fell down a bit with the US regulators in terms of competition authority, because actually reducing the amount of competition in the market is rarely seen to give rise to greater innovation. Normally, more competition enables people to do that. So it was a slightly challenging argument to swallow, I think, at the time.
No, I think that's right. I think the other thing that you see underlying a lot of this activity, and the reason it sort of continues at pace, is there's a deep sense of entrepreneurialism within this sector, right? People who you're seeing the current versions of, again, our memory doesn't go back far enough to show the early days of this, but the current iterations of McGill and sort of people who had built big careers at some of the bigger brokers, then spinning out, creating their own business, building that up. In a number of years, it wouldn't be a shock if McGill then gets acquired by another bigger broking firm. You saw it with Capsicum, with Graham Chilton going away, setting up a different broking house, kind of as an extension. Was it of JLT? Or was it of Gallagher? Of Gallagher, extension of Gallagher. Sort of partnered with them, ran that whole business, and then rebought by Gallagher, and so you're seeing this sort of activity happen, and the same thing with Tiger now. Rod, who had come from a Benfield background, set up Tiger Risk, just now acquired or merged with Howden. He's still there leading the Howden Re sort of division now, but it wouldn't be a shock for a number of people who've been remunerated quite well to then be like, well, we're going to go do our own thing, and sort of this cycle repeats itself.
You've seen it on the underwriting side as well, interestingly, so the Berkshire Hathaway Trans Re deal, I think it wasn't mentioned much in the coverage at the time. Everyone was like, oh yeah, good idea. But if you look back actually to sort of about 5 years ago, Gen Re and Trans Re actually set up a partnership back then where Trans Re was effectively the underwriting manager for all of Gen Re's broked business, because Gen Re historically direct-only reinsurer, doesn't use brokers. They set up an agreement where they basically provided Trans Re with Gen Re capacity, and Trans Re dealt with all the broked business. So it was sort of only the next step in a partnership that almost seemed planned all along to then actually go and acquire Allegheny and get Trans Re as part of that deal. So it's interesting, as you say, that a lot of dancing personalities that evolve into combining organizations. But
one of the other things that you mentioned in passing was sort of you have at the time one of the largest syndicates, which was Catlin Syndicate 2003, who then was bought by XL, who then subsequently bought by AXA-XL. One of my favorite things in this sort of melting pot of mergers and acquisitions that's always happening is people who are at one company, they get acquired, they then leave that company, and then their new company gets acquired by that same company. And
it does happen a lot.
I knew someone at Aon who had been employed by Aon like 6 different times. Like they're employed by this company, who then Aon bought, and they left and went somewhere else. Then Aon bought that company, and they just. And I remember they were in the U.S. and they were kind of like, I'm just gonna stay here now. There's no point in me leaving because this sort of thing can happen. Where yep, back to my old job. Kind of thing, which is quite an entertaining part of it as well, when you sort of see the sort of quirks of our industry playing out like that.
It's so true. I wanted to go back as well and touch a bit on some of the deal rationale, because we talked about it's probably not cost and it's probably not innovation most of the time. We have seen some interesting innovation deals, so Aon buying CoverWallet, for example, or more on the insurance side again, arguably Howden Tiger for some of the Tiger tech stuff they were doing, like Tiger Eye and so on.
Yeah, I think there'll be some some bigger tech plays there for sure.
And so we do see bits of new innovation kind of plays, but a lot of the time it is pure growth and market share driven. Some commentators may say ego driven as well. It's hard not to get caught up in the excitement of mergers and merger wars, especially when a competitor makes a big acquisition. It feels like there's pressure from the street to respond by buying someone yourself as well. Well, it's not always proven to be the best response. But one that's been probably the most interesting in the past 3 or 4 years has been the perceived lack of choice within the reinsurance broking environment, and really spurred on by the Aon Willis attempted merger. Seeing, I won't name all of them, but the huge investment suddenly in the Locktons, the Howdens, and so on, all reignited in their energy. Gallagher as well at the time, to go and build big reinsurance brokers because there was a perceived gap in the market. And you saw, interestingly, Acrisure by Beach, for example, begin to start to leverage their insurance relationships and weight as a means of saying, well, we could tap into the vertical here as well and use that again downstream to access more reinsurance business. Makes sense. Arguably, Howden Tiger, really similar thing, right? Howden Re was relatively small compared to the bigger players, so buy the biggest who isn't one of the big three, and then you're launched up in terms of scale, and you've very quickly gained credible capabilities which give you a distribution to access that profitable reinsurance business up the stream. And I think reinsurance continues to be seen as a more profitable broking business because of the deal size, because of the legacy model for doing commission, because of, especially with things like Supersede coming in, the increasingly lower cost at which you can service reinsurance business. It's a very high margin space.
Yeah, I remember something when I was at Aon, and this is probably decade old sort of information. But there was something where the Aon Benfield unit, the reinsurance unit at the time of following that merger, made as much profit as the rest of Aon. Like it was a tenth of the size, but it's such a different business, and so I think you're exactly right. Where you can sort of run a traditional insurance business and sort of scrape revenue from all volume focused deal making. But the reinsurance side is much more lucrative. And I think there's a huge opportunity to sort of add that as an addition to traditional broking house, an Acrisure, a Howden, who's sort of built a big insurance brand that would benefit quite a lot from that reinsurance space. So I think there's certainly a bit of that happening, but it's not without its challenges. And I think mega mergers or not, these things can be very, very difficult. Everything from integrating sort of information and technology to culture, But how do you think about the biggest risks of these sorts of things? Like, what is, even if you're buying a mid-tier, geography play, like how would you begin to assess and think about the various risks that are exposed to the buyer?
Yeah, so it's I'll try and talk about it from both broker and underwriter perspectives simultaneously, but typically acquisitions into a space mean new market entrants, which mean new pressure for growth and new pressure for results within that particular market. So let's say it's reinsurance broking, or let's say it's mid-market property insurance business, whatever it is, you're going to drive competitive pressure in that space. And normally, in most other industries, the result of that would be pressure on prices. In broking, that doesn't seem to happen yet. To some extent, maybe we're starting to see more generous rebates being offered by incoming brokers, and then it's a really difficult question for the brokers whether they want to match that offer that's coming in from smaller brokers, or lose the business, or stick to their original prices near enough and hope they still win these RFPs because of their clout and scale and leverage and so on. Similarly, on the underwriting side, new entrants or entrants that have had loads of capital pumped into them and have been told hit these growth targets have the effect of potentially driving down prices as competition rises, and therefore it becomes a question for everybody else as to whether they want to stay on that business or whether they think that they have the brand strength and the clout to still be a crucial partner to the client in that scenario. So in every case, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is going to be the excitement from new entrants in an incredibly cash-rich and optimistic acquisition environment will put pricing pressure on everybody involved, the incomers and the incumbents. And because of that, that could put pressure on the sustainability of all of those players' books going forwards and on their operations and on the way they do business, which is exciting, actually, as well as being a challenge, because then people turn to operations and they turn to innovation and ways of being able to service the new pressure where historically, arguably, there hasn't been enough pressure to force people to look seriously at alternative ways of doing things to the way they've always done things.
Yeah, I think there's a really big opportunity for those smaller brokers, and you wrote an article about this a long time ago now. But this idea that previously the ability to provide sort of technical innovation for clients was reserved only for the biggest firms who could afford tens of millions, if not more, every year, building out solutions to help clients leverage analytics to help their clients success. So in an RFP, they could bring so much more to the table than any of those smaller competitors could. I think you're seeing this democratization of access to technology moving downstream, where not only companies like ours, but others who are making it easier to build back office tools or pricing tools or similar, where what was once well, only Munich or Swiss or only Energies could ever support me here.
Yeah,
that's no longer becoming the case. So I think to your point around pricing pressure, I think that will ramp up because those smaller firms won't have the sort of cost base that they're sort of defending, and they could go in going, well, we could take 4%, 5%, 10% off these prices and still make the margins that we need. And I think you could really see an acceleration into that. So I think that's a really interesting space for us to watch over the sort of next 5 to 10 years. The other thing that they touch on a little bit, and I think I'm looking at this much more from a broking hat, but I'd be interested to see if you see this from an underwriting side, is the importance of culture in these conversations. And I think culture from a reinsurance broking firm perspective, I think is a little bit different than sort of how we sort of traditionally frame culture around just D&I and those sorts of things similarly, but more around entrepreneurialism and autonomy and, are those teams and those divisions and those geographies empowered to sort of go and drum up business and be rewarded for it? Or is it you're part of the system now and here's the playbook, and like they don't get so I think some of the times mergers work really well is when firms are very aligned with how they run their businesses, and where they break is when you sort of try to force these things together, which are fundamentally different, and the personalities within those organizations don't really match.
And this is one of the areas I think that's most commented on in general sort of merger and acquisition theory as the treatment of an acquisition and the culture in particular is so often misaligned with the motive for the acquisition originally. So, for example, companies that are acquired because of their distinctive go-to-market or culture or autonomy or way of doing things that enables them to command a premium price or operate at a much lower margin are the first to be destroyed as soon as these companies are acquired because, acquisition mode, we should strip away everything and convert them to our way of doing things. When the advice would usually be to let those businesses run at arm's length and, if anything, try and encourage your own business to follow them. And it often happens the other way around as well, where you keep at arm's length and let carry on businesses that aren't adding any of those values. Very, very easy to confuse. What type of acquisition is this that you're going for? Did you want them because of who they are? And a lot of people would argue that some of the big underwriting ones that we've earlier mentioned have had this issue where, I mean, that AXA XL is a really topical one back at the time because you saw the acquisition by a very cautious, big French insurer that likes to post very stable and predictable returns and steady growth, of a categorically volatile underwriting business that focuses on specialty classes and heavily reinsurance classes. And then upon realizing that, go, maybe we didn't want that after all.
Yeah.
And, then had to set about handling that. But also in terms of managing the way the businesses were run, massively different cultures between, as you said, what was effectively the legacy Catlin team with a layer of legacy Excel on top of it, then being met with a different language and a different culture with a French operating model, I guess, that was quite different.
Yeah.
And I think there have been a lot of observations as other companies like Convex sprung up that would point, as you said, to culture as one of the main reasons why people were making moves and looking to do things differently, because they felt like their old company wasn't going to be the same after an acquisition.
Yeah.
I pick on that example, but it's the same, across so many. We saw a lot of underwriting businesses acquired by large Japanese businesses, for example, that had a similar confusion then about what their culture would be going forward. So I remember one such syndicate talking about how when they found out that the new owners were in town, they had to quickly hide all the beers, and tidy up the underwriting boxes and make sure that everything was good and that everybody was staying on the box at the right time and so on.
I think the ambition to let companies run at an arm's length and do what they're doing well and do what, if you buy them for that reason, that's making them successful. I think I am aligned with that ambition, and I think a lot of companies are try to make that work, but don't have the existing framework to do that well. Like, you need to have a Berkshire style model, or as you mentioned, some of these Japanese conglomerate style model where the parent company is very comfortable running dozens of brands who do this very differently. But what often happens is, even if they try that, it doesn't take very long for in an executive meeting for them to talk about strategy and then be like, well, we just need to get the data together in the same way. And then they sort of, let's put them on the same system. And then bit by bit, you're sort of forcing the smaller part of the business unit to sort of follow the rules of the bigger business unit, so that somewhere in a management meeting, they have sort of aligned and consolidated and reconciled data. And that's kind of where it begins. So even if the ambition is to say, we're going to let them run and do their own thing and we think they're great, I think that the time is already ticking on that blowing up.
It's interesting, and I think you remind me of a couple of interesting things. One on the theoretical side, which is around conglomerates in general, and this kind of weird argument that conglomerates are better diversified and therefore should bring you better returns. If you're investing in an insurance company, why not invest in Berkshire or Markel or somebody that's got a range of businesses because they're better protected? And there's a fallacy there, it's argued, because shareholders can diversify their own portfolios, just buy lots of different companies. You don't have to.
There's another way to do this.
There's another way to achieve diversification, but I guess you can see maybe some synergies if those businesses are strategically assembled, and perhaps in the sense that you're willing to delegate to somebody as wise as I've forgotten his nickname, but whatever Warren Buffett's funny nickname is.
I don't know.
It's like the something of Omaha. I can't remember what the anyway.
Oracle of Omaha.
Oracle of Omaha, maybe that's a good one. If not,
again, thanks for shouting into your headphones.
but yeah, you're willing to delegate portfolio diversification to him. So that's one interesting thing on the conglomerate side of things. What's also interesting, and what we haven't mentioned on the insurance, reinsurance, mergers and acquisition side, is that there is an interesting cost saving, very appropriate to this podcast. Not this codpast. It's a spoonerism for you. Where basically acquired entities will often, when you were talking about rolling up data, acquired entities will often end up being brought under the umbrella of the larger group's reinsurance buying strategy, which is super interesting, because whereas then the market, so the reinsurance market as a whole, used to have two customers, they now have one, where they might have had differential rates or commission processes or rebates as brokers, or different ways of doing business with different partners before actually suddenly when that becomes one deal, usually if that buyer has any negotiating power, they're going to push towards the terms of the one that had the preferred terms. So often actually the reinsurance market and size and profitability as a whole loses out during one of these big cedent to cedent mergers or acquisitions because they're probably going to spend less on reinsurance afterwards. Yeah. Otherwise, they failed on quite a big synergy opportunity. Yeah. Or they realize that they bought something they shouldn't have and they buy way more reinsurance than they used to. Can also happen.
This is a disaster. I know. We'll buy more reinsurance to save us. No, it's a really good point. And this is where these sort of knock-on effects sort of always emerge. And then with that, the sort of urgency for the big brokers, the urgency for the big reinsurers to win that deal. If you see a mega merger within the cedents in the insurance sector, like there's a real need for like the sort of RFP process becomes very aggressive because it's one fewer client and that deal is now bigger. Yeah. And it's a game of making sure you've got all the big accounts.
And potentially your critical relationships don't matter anymore as well.
Yep.
Which is quite interesting too.
Well, this is another one when we talk about the broking side, a lot of these relationships are very, very long standing. And if you've built, 15 or 20-year relationship with the leadership or the family that owns that insurance company, and they then get bought by a much more sort of ruthless conglomerate who doesn't really care that you're broker and you go have the kids are married or whatever it might be. It's like that the sort of crux and the sort of critical points of that relationship sometimes are just ignored now because that new parent doesn't really care about that. Mm-hmm. So you're right, some of those things erode as well.
And we diverged, I guess, quite a lot from the initial question, or one of the initial questions, which is what are the risks of these mergers? We have to talk a bit about systems. Mm-hmm. Your earlier point around Aon, for example, having emerged from like 170 different companies. Do they now have 170 different systems? Yeah. They don't. I don't know. Haven't counted them. And again, actually, I think that there's some really good case studies there of getting people onto a really good system and onboarding. But every company, when they go through an acquisition, and the two previous companies have different ways of doing things, whether that's a system of record, whether that's claim systems, whether that's technical accounting, whatever it might be. In each case, you have to choose, right, are we going to go with A, with B, with some hybrid, keep both, or scrap both, and C is now the way forwards. And what I find fascinating is how exhausting this must be for ops and IT teams in our industry, because the mergers and acquisition space is so hot that by the time they've just finished painting the Golden Gate Bridge and bringing together all of legacy X's systems onto legacy Y, they get bought again, right? And it's just a constant process of like, we just got everybody onto that system, and now we've been told that everyone's going to move on to this system instead. 2 years of our entire team's life wasted.
I think in the systems piece in our industry, the way technology has always been deployed is you have most things sit on-prem or
built in-house.
Or built in-house. And so you might have it where they all have the same system. Oh, but that team's using like version 2, and those teams using like version 1.7, and those teams using version 3. And so those actually don't map as easily. And what you can sometimes see is certain entities who buy a lot of people just sort of let that all carry on as is. And then one company buys the other and realizes they've now inherited like 14 different systems with that one acquisition and the need to sort of reconcile this stuff. And one of the things that you'll see a lot in our industry, especially with the data, trying to get that all aligned and mapped out to see where the relationships all sit, is the complexity of the industry's sort of company hierarchies and how entities actually work. So we talk about like Munich Re and Swiss Re and Ren Re. Like all of those companies have numerous subsidiaries and numerous divisions where it's like, oh, the Bermuda team is technically called this, and there's all these legal names. But when you go into these various systems, depending on how big the company might be, they might only trade with Swiss Re one time. So they might just happen to have it say this. But the new bigger company can't do it that way, or they manage how they treat other counterparties very differently. So it begins to get very, very messy very, very quickly. There's a reason these things take multiple years to sort of unpack. So I think a lot of the challenges with a big merger, especially the bigger they get, is we'll know how we've landed in like a 3-year window, because you're not going to get to a position of a starting point until then.
I think it's also especially interesting on an outwards reinsurance side, where most companies will have sort of counterparty exposure limits where they don't want to have more than X of their coverage provided by a single counterparty. Yeah. And it's like, oh no, A has just bought B, and we buy significant amounts of reinsurance from both of them. Have we gone over the 20% max we set ourselves? Nobody knows, actually, because we have to manually go into every single, report that each broker on each placement prepared and look at how much of that deal in what currency was done with reinsurer A and with reinsurer B, and then add it all up in a spreadsheet that we made ourselves.
I would love to see the aggregate industry cost for that. Right? So AXA buys XL Catlin.
Yeah.
Like, how many thousands of man hours around the world were spent doing that exact
Just trying
exercise?
to work out how much. Yeah,
going, okay, hang on a second.
So how much do we do now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just chaos.
And the same for, I remember, trying to track this. I have various underwriting entities at Lloyd's as well, but broker consolidation as well. It's like, we will keep our sort of happiness here if, the total share of our business brought to us by the top 3 is less than 30%. Yeah. And then something changes, like, okay, nothing we can do about it. So we'll change the RAG rating to be, if it goes above 40%, we'll be upset. It's gone above 40. It's gone above 50%. Oh, and just carries on. It's like, we're now entirely dependent on 3 brokers, or similar, or 2 in some cases.
Yeah. If the Oracle of Omaha doesn't perform, our entire book collapses.
Yeah.
But that was everything you need to know. So go forth and buy companies.
Or don't.
Or don't. Don't take our advice for it.
Get bought instead.
But I think this is a really, really interesting one. I think we'll certainly touch on future M&A, because our industry it's rife with it. We'll have another one with it by the end of the year, I'm sure. But I think this is an interesting topic that warrants us tackling other angles from as well in future podcasts. So
watch out for M&A of the week.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you, everyone, and look forward to speaking to you all again soon.
Stay tuned. See you next time.